I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. My name is Emma Kami and I'll be your host today. On May 29th, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez announced an early general election for July 23rd. Sanchez made the announcement only hours after his Socialist Party performed poorly in municipal and regional elections on May 28th. According to polls, the general election could result in a far-right party entering the Spanish government for the first time since the return of democracy in the late 1970s. To discuss what could happen next in Spain, I'm joined by Adriano Bosoni, RANE's Director of Analysis. Welcome, Adriano.
Hey, Emma, it's nice talking with you again.
You too. So let's start from the beginning. What happened in the regional and municipal elections, and why did Sanchez decide to hold an early general election?
Yeah, so on May 28th, Spain held regional and municipal elections across the country. It was a very heated campaign. Even though the elections were supposed to be about municipal and regional issues, it had a very clear national undertone because the main opposition party, the People's Party, which is a conservative party, and a small but growing far-right party, Vox, they were basically presenting the elections as a referendum on the tenure of Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez and his Socialist Party and their main left-wing partners, the Unidas Podemos party. So it was supposed to be a regional and municipal election, but it had clear national implications. And the results were quite bad for the ruling Socialist Party. They got roughly 28% of the vote, whereas the People's Party, they got around 32% of the vote. The far-right Vox Party also performed quite well. They got around 8% of the vote from roughly 3.5% in the previous election 4 years ago. So, to make a long story short, the Conservatives and the far right performed quite well. The Conservatives actually won in several regions that were previously governed by the Socialists. And to complicate things further for Prime Minister Sanchez and his Socialist Party, Podemos performed poorly as well. They didn't even make it to the regional parliaments in big regions like Madrid and Valencia. So very, very shortly after the elections results were announced, Sanchez went live on television saying that he was going to hold an early general election. Spain was not supposed to hold the general election until December, but Sanchez thought that it was too far in the future and that he needed to have the election as quickly as possible. Basically, by doing this, he is trying to prevent his authority from deteriorating further. December is just too far in the future, so he was also worried that waiting so long would have resulted in members of his party actually questioning his leadership. There's also an interesting dynamic here at play because after the elections in the regions and in the municipalities, if the People's Party wants to enter regional or municipal governments, in many cases they will have to negotiate with Vox Party to appoint such governments. So Sanchez is basically hoping that these negotiations between the Conservatives and the far right will get a lot of coverage, and they will make left-wing voters and moderate voters very worried about the same happening at the national level. So Sanchez probably thought that holding the election in July, simultaneously when the People's Party and Vox are negotiating to appoint these regional and municipal governments, would mobilize left-wing voters who stay at home in the May 28 elections, and also convince moderate voters to support Sanchez and his Socialist Party to prevent the People's Party and Vox from taking over the national government. So it's basically a gamble. The thing is, it's a risky move because the electoral momentum in Spain seems to have moved against the center-left and the left, and in favor of the center-right and the far-right.
So will the center-right and the far-right form a government in Spain after the general election?
Well, that's the million euros question, I would say, because ideally the People's Party would like to govern alone. They don't want to be in a coalition with a potentially problematic party like Vox. The thing is, if current polls are to be trusted, the People's Party will not win enough seats in the Spanish parliament to govern alone. So they will need to reach some kind of agreement with Vox. This agreement could look like a proper coalition deal in which Vox takes cabinet positions and is a formal member of the Spanish government, or it could be a kind of agreement according to which Vox, for instance, abstains or supports the appointment of a People's Party prime minister, but then stays in parliament and doesn't formally enter the government. Either way, this would be a significant event in Spain because it would actually give a far-right party influence in Spanish policy for the first time since the return to democracy in the late 1970s. For decades, Spain has moved from center-left to center-right and back to center-left and then to center-right political governments, and having a far-right as a proper member of a coalition or supporting a government from parliament, it would be a significant development in Spain. This would have all sorts of consequences. From a fiscal perspective, a conservative government would seek to dismantle many of the tax reforms that the Socialist Party implemented during the pandemic and especially during the energy crisis. Sanchez introduced very controversial taxes like a windfall tax on banks and energy companies, a tax on people with large fortunes, and a conservative party would seek to dismantle that. But what I think would be the main domestic implication is that there would be significant resistance in Spain to a government where the far right is a member of the government or supports the government from parliament. It would lead to protests from left-wing groups, from unions, also from groups such as the LGBTQ plus community, because Vox has very, very hawkish and very conservative positions on many social issues. So it would create significant backlash in that regard. It could also reignite secessionist movements, particularly in Catalonia. We need to keep in mind that under the socialist government, there was kind of a detente, there was kind of a cordial relations between the central government in Madrid and the regional government in Catalonia. But if the Socialist Party exits the government, and if the People's Party, and in particular if the People's Party with support from Vox takes over the next government, Catalonia will not be happy about it. Vox in particular is campaigning on things like re-centralizing the Spanish state and taking back powers and over policy areas that are currently under the control of the regional governments. They have a very pro-Spanish language rhetoric, saying that Spanish is the only official language of the country, which is a very big deal in Catalonia, where most of the population speaks Catalan, and they are very protective of their language and their traditions. So if there is a far-right party in power in Spain, the backlash in Catalonia and possibly also in the Basque country would be significant.
And then what would this mean for Spain's position in the European Union?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the election happens only 23 days after Spain takes over the 6-month rotating presidency of the European Union. You know that every EU member state takes over the bloc's presidency for 6 months. And when they are in that presidency, they can introduce topics on the discussion agenda, they organize meetings, they act as brokers of deals between member states over many policy areas. So if Spain has to do this while also dealing with first an electoral campaign which will consume most of July, and then with the formation of a government which will consume most of August and potentially some of September as well, it means that during at least half of its 6 months presidency of the European Union, Spain will be focused primarily on domestic issues, and they will not really have the bandwidth to deal with European issues on top of their domestic issues. And then there's another complication. The Socialist Party has set its agenda for the rotating presidency of the European Union. But the thing is, if there is a new government in place, that new government may basically scrap most of that agenda and try to impose its own topics instead. So it would be problematic, and the policy making process in the EU could slow down significantly if Madrid fails to meet its presidency obligations, which, I insist, range from introducing topics in the bloc's policy agenda to brokering deals between member states over controversial issues. So there are a few topics that would be particularly affected, I would say. For instance, Vox is quite skeptical of climate change, and we know that climate change is a big deal for the European Union and for the European Commission in particular. So if we have Vox with a skeptical position on this, they will try to fight back or to remove some climate change related topics from the policy agenda. The Socialist Party was all about improving ties between the European Union and Latin America during the Spanish presidency of the EU. But Vox is a party that says we don't want to have any interactions, or we don't want to have any kind of political context with left-wing governments in Latin America, which could create problems between Spain/the EU and left-wing governments in places like Brazil and Mexico. Vox could also push against the ongoing EU negotiations over a free trade agreement with the common market of the South, that's Mercosur, which includes Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay, especially if it opens EU markets to competitive agricultural exports from the likes of Brazil and Argentina. Vox also has a very strong anti-immigration position, which means that it could result in a worsening of ties between Spain and Morocco, because Vox has accused Morocco of using migration as leverage to obtain economic and political concessions from Madrid. In fact, Vox's electoral platform calls for the deployment of the Spanish military in the Spanish exclaves in Morocco to protect them. So it would be problematic for foreign affairs. I would not go as far as to say that it would threaten Spain's membership in the European Union or the Eurozone. I don't think that's the case. The People's Party is still a very pro-European, pro-Eurozone party, so I don't think that Spain's membership in the EU would be at stake, but we would certainly see an increase of tensions between Madrid and Brussels, especially if Vox is a formal member of the coalition government. If they only provide external support in parliament, maybe its influence would be weaker, but still, it would be a significant change of direction from the current left-wing governments in Spain.
Wow, so lots of implications both internally and externally. Definitely something to keep watching. Thank you so much, Adriano.
Of course, thank you.
Learn how geopolitical events like this could affect your business with RANE Worldview. Our flagship risk intelligence products provide clients with access to the insights and analyses they need to make more informed decisions and drive better risk management outcomes. Sign up at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. I'm Emma Kami. Thanks for listening.